Christmas Carol. Chapter 5, The Ghost of
Christmas Present. Woo!
Okay, let's go. What's going to happen to Scroogey Poochie? Scrooge awakened in the middle of a loud snore. He sat up in bed to clear his head, realizing that the clock would soon be striking 1. He knew that something inside him woke him up at the moment, so he'd be awake to have his meeting with the second ghost. Rather than wait and be surprised again by the ghost opening one of the curtains, Scrooge pushed them all aside nervously and lay down again to wait nervously. "What will this one look like?" muttered Scrooge. "I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised by anything from a baby to a rhinoceros." So, prepared for almost anything, Scrooge was surprised when the clock struck 1 and no ghost appeared. As the minutes went by, 5, 10, 15, and nothing came, he began to tremble as he lay there. A blaze of light began shining on his head. Perhaps it's Scrooge from the sitting room, thought Scrooge. Perhaps it's coming from the sitting room, thought Scrooge. I'd better trace it. So, getting up out of bed, softly, Scrooge shuffled in his slippers to the door. The instant his hands touched the knob, it turned it. A strange voice called his name. Ebenezer Scrooge.
Ebenezer Scrooge. Enter this room.
Scrooge obeyed. It was his own sitting room, there was no doubt, but it had changed completely. Leaves and branches of holly, mistletoe, and ivy, all covered with berries, hung from the walls and ceiling. A roaring fire blazed in the hearth, and piled on the floor, forming a throne-like couch, were huge roasts of meat, turkeys, and suckling pigs. Long strings of sausages, minced pies, plum puddings, apples, oranges, cakes, bowls of punch. Seated on this feast throne was a jolly, smiling giant. High above him, he held a torch shaped like a horn of plenty. "Come in," called the ghost warmly. Scrooge entered timidly, his head bowed before the ghost, although the ghost's eyes were friendly and kind. Scrooge did not want to meet him. "Look at me," said the spirit. "I am the ghost of Christmas Present." Scrooge obeyed. What he saw was a figure dressed in a simple dark green robe trimmed with white fur. It hung loosely around the spirit's body, tied around his waist was an ancient rusty sheath, but no sword was in it. The spirit's feet were bare below his robe. On his head was a holly wreath set with shiny icicles. Dark brown hair hung long and loosely from his head, framing a friendly face. Let's see it. There he is. The horn of plenty. So, sparkling eyes and a cheery voice. There he is again. "Now, you have never seen anything like me before, have you?" asked the spirit. "Never," answered Scrooge. "But please, good spirit, take me wherever you wish. Last night I was forced to go with the first spirit, and I learned a valuable lesson. Tonight, if you have anything to teach me, I am ready." "Touch my robe," commanded the spirit. Scrooge obeyed and instantly stuck to the robe. And in the same instant, the holly, mistletoe, berries, meat, pigs, sausages, pudding, punch, all vanished. Too, so did the room, the fire, the glowing light, and the night. Scrooge and the spirit now stood on the city streets of Christmas morning. The weather was cold and the sky gloomy. Snow covered everything, white on the rooftop, and gray and black in the road, where carts and wagons made deep furrows. Some people were shoveling snow from the pavement, and others were sweeping it from their roofs, much to the delight of children who watched as rooftop snowstorms fell in the road. Even the people on the roofs were having a jolly time calling to each other, and even throwing a snowball or two at each other. The fruit shop was open, and baskets of chestnuts and almonds sat at the door. Apples and pears and oranges were piled high in pyramids. Bunches of grapes dangled from hooks to entice last-minute holiday shoppers. From the grocer's shop came delicious scents of tea and coffee, of cinnamon and sugar and spices. The poultry shops were still open, with juicy turkeys, squabs, geese begging to be carried home and eaten for dinner. Soon the steeple bell called all the people, the good people of church, and the street was filled with them, in their best clothes, in their happiest faces. At the same time, from every street and lane came scores of poor people carrying their dinners to the baker's shops. For on this day, each baker welcomed the poor in his shop to warm their Christmas dinner in his big oven. As these poor people passed the Spirit, and Scrooge filled the Spirit lifted the cover of each man's dish and sprinkled incense from his torch on it. But what a strange torch it was! For once or twice, when two dinner carriers bumped into each other and exchanged angry words, the Spirit sprinkled a few drops of water from the torch onto them. Their good spirits returned immediately. Is there a particular flavor that you sprinkle from your torch? Yes, my own. Can that flavor be added to any dinner today? To any, said the Spirit, but mostly to the poor dinner, for that's the dinner that needs it the most. They continued on, invisible to the outside of town, and arrived at the home of Scrooge's clerk, Bob Cratchit. The Spirit stopped at the doorway and blessed the small house with the sprinkling of his torch. Inside, Mrs. Cratchit, Bob's wife, was setting the table. Her often mended but clean dress was tied with colorful holiday ribbons. One of her daughters, Belinda, was helping her while her son, Peter, was dipping a fork into a pan of potatoes to see if they were done. Two smaller Cratchits, a boy and a girl, came tearing into the room. What a delicious smell our noses caught outside the baker's, cried the boy excitedly. It must be our Christmas goose, added the girl. I just know it was. Where can your dear father be? Asked Mrs. Cratchit. And your brother, Tiny Tim. They should have been home from church by now. Even your sister, Martha, is a half hour late getting there. I'm here, Mother, called a voice at the doorway. Bless your heart, dear Martha, said Miss Cratchit, kissing her and taking her bonnet and shawl. But how late you are. Was there anything wrong at the milliner's shop? We had a good deal of work to finish last night, said Martha, and all the apprentices had to clear away that morning. Well, it doesn't matter, said Mrs. Cratchit. As long as you're here, now sit by the fire and warm up. No, Father's coming, cried the two young Cratchits. Hide, Mother, hide. Mother hid behind the closet door, and in came Bob, his threadbare clothes darned but clean. On his shoulders was Tiny Tim, carrying his crutch in the hand that wasn't holding onto his father's neck. Why, where's our mother? Cried Bob, looking at the family. Not coming, said his wife solemnly. Not coming, said Bob, suddenly losing his happy spirit. Not coming home on Christmas Day? Martha hated to see her father so disappointed, so she ran out from behind the door and into his arms, while the two Cratchit boys gently eased Tiny Tim down off the father's shoulders and helped him into the kitchen to check on the pudding on the stove. And how did little Tiny Tim behave in church? Asked Miss Cratchit. As good as gold, said Bob. Sometimes that boy gets the strangest thoughts, though, but I guess it's from being alone so much while other children his age are out playing together. Why, what were his thoughts, dear? Asked Mrs. Cratchit. On the way home from church, he told me that he hoped people saw him in the church because he was a cripple. When I asked him why, he said it would remind people that on Christmas Day they should remember their God who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Bob's voice trembled as he told this to his wife. Just then a noisy little crutch was heard on the floor, and in came Tiny Tim. His brother and sister helped him get up on his and stood by the fire. Peter and the two young Cratchits then went to bring in the goose and returned in the procession. Mrs. Cratchit brought the gravy while Peter mashed the potatoes, Belinda sweetened the applesauce, and Martha heated the plates. Bob pulled Tiny Tim's stool to the corner beside him at the table, while the two young Cratchits brought chairs around for everyone. At last, the family was seated, and grace was said. There was never such a goose. Everyone agreed while Mrs. Cratchit was carving. Even though the goose was quite small for such a large family, the dinner was filled in with potatoes and applesauce, and not a single morsel was left over. As Belinda took away the plates, Mrs. Cratchit went to get the pudding. Suppose it falls apart, worried the young Cratchit boy. Suppose someone came in and stole it, said the girl. That would be worse. But in half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, smiling proudly as she held the flaming pudding decorated with a twig of holly on top. My dear, said Bob, this is the best pudding you have made since our marriage. I was so worried, she said, sighing with relief. I wasn't sure it would come out right. for I didn't have enough flour. Everyone said the pudding was wonderful, and not one person mentioned what a small pudding it was for such a large family. Then all the family gathered in a circle around the hearth. On a small table at Bob's elbow stood all the glasses the family possessed, 2 tumblers and a cup without a handle. These were filled with a hot mixture of gin and lemons, but it could not have tasted any better if it were served in golden goblets. As Bob served it, he proposed a toast. A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us. But the family repeated the toast with Tiny Tim and the last of all, God bless us, everyone. Tiny Tim sat very close to Father's side on a little stool. Bob held the boy withered little hand in his hand, holding it gently yet tightly, as if he feared that the boy might be taken away. So here's a picture of the toast. And here we go. Spirit, said Scrooge, becoming interested as he had never been before. Tell me if Tiny Tim will live. I see an empty stool in the corner and a crutch without an owner. If these shadows of the future, which only I can see, remain unchanged, that is Tiny Tim's fate. No, no, cried Scrooge. Oh, no, kind Spirit, spare him. If these shadows remain unchanged, repeated the Spirit, he will die. But why not? After all, you said it would be better if these poor, unfortunate creatures died off and decreased the population. You said it yourself, Scrooge. Those were your only words. Scrooge hung his head up upon hearing the words as he had spoken to 2 visitors in the warehouse. Upon hearing those very words spoken back to him, man, said the ghost, if you are a man in your heart, take back those wicked words. Why should you decide who shall live and who shall die? Perhaps heaven will decide that you are less fit to live than this poor man's child. Trembling Scrooge could only stare at the ground, but the sound of his name being called from the shadows caused him to look up. To Mr. Scrooge, said Bob, raising his tumbler toast. To Mr. Scrooge, who made this feast possible. Mr. Scrooge, indeed, cried Mrs. Cratchit angrily. If I had him here, I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast on. Why, Robert? Nobody knows better than you what a stingy, hard, hateful, unfeeling old man he is. My dear, said Bob calmly, it is Christmas Day. Well, admitted his wife grudgingly, I'll drink to his health for your sake, Robert, and for the sake of the holiday spirit, but never for Mr. Scrooge's sake. Long life to Mr. Scrooge. I'm sure he's having a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Children joined in a toast to Scrooge, too, but no one in the family seemed to take much pleasure in doing it. The name of Scrooge darkened everyone's party spirit for a full 5 minutes. But when it passed, they all returned to their happy selves, for the Cratchits were a happy family, grateful what they did have and content with each other. At the scene of the Cratchit family faded into the tiny shadows, Scrooge kept his eyes fixed on Tiny Tim until the last. As Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets back to town, it was getting dark and the snow was falling heavily. The brightness of roaring fires shone from all the windows they passed, with scenes of holiday preparations being made in each house. Ahead of them, children were running out their doors onto the snow to greet married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, and aunts, and to welcome them to dinner. Guests such as these were entering all the houses along the way. How the ghost beamed at the sight of these happy people. Oh, they went farther outside town. Then suddenly, without a word of warning, from the ghost, Scrooge saw that they had arrived on a bleak, deserted moor. Giant boulders lay on the grass, and amid frozen moss and coarse grass, in the west, the setting sun shone its last streak of red, while the rest of the sky was filled with the darkest night. What kind of place is this? Asked Scrooge. A place where miners live, said the Spirit. These men may labor deep inside the earth, but they still know me. They know the spirit of Christmas present. See? And he pointed to the lighted window of a hut. Scrooge and the ghost walked quickly towards it, passing their invisible selves through the wall of mud and stone. They found a cheerful group around a glowing fire, an old man and woman, and their children, and their grandchildren were all decked out in their holiday clothes, singing Christmas songs. The Spirit did not delay here, only long enough for Scrooge to see that here, too, was the spirit of Christmas. Take hold of my robe, the Spirit told Scrooge, and they left the Spirit and then the moor. High above the moor, Scrooge looked down and back, horrified. Where are we going? He cried, as he saw the only roaring sea below and ahead of them. Then ahead, on a reef, sunken rocks, several miles from the shore, stood a lone lighthouse. But even here, the two lighthouse keepers were sitting at a rough table near a fire, wishing each other a Merry Christmas while celebrating with their mug of grog. Again, the spirit and Scrooge sped on, above the black and heaving sea, until they landed on a deck of a ship beside the helmsman at the wheel. The officers and the crew were all at their stations, but each man either humming a Christmas song or had a Christmas thought, or was talking to the companions about other Christmases. Then suddenly, these low voices were interrupted by a hearty laugh. It was with great surprise that Mr. Scrooge recognized his nephew's laugh. It was with even greater surprise that Scrooge found himself in a bright room with the spirit at his side. Ha ha, laughed Scrooge's nephew. Fred, ha ha ha, as he laughed, and he was rolling his head and making the funniest faces. Fred's wife, a pretty young thing with a dimpled face, was laughing too, just as heartily as her husband. And so were their friends, gathered for the holiday at home. As he said, Fred went on. He said that Christmas was a humbug, and he believed it too. Shame on him, said Fred's wife. Who was Scrooge's niece by marriage? Oh, I don't know, said Fred. He's a funny old fellow. True, he could be more pleasant, but I have nothing against him. You told me he's very rich, he said. What of it, my dear? His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it. He doesn't use it to live comfortably, and he doesn't even have the enjoyment of knowing he is ever going to do any good for us with it. Well, I have no patience with him, said the niece, and all the ladies present agreed. Oh, I have patience, said Fred. I feel sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him even if I tried. After all, who really suffers by his unpleasant ways? Himself, always. Here's the perfect example. He decided he didn't like us and so refused our invitation to Christmas dinner. And what's the result? He lost out on a very good dinner. See, it is he who suffers. Yes, yes, cried Fred's wife, clapping her hands. Do go on, Fred. I was only going to add that Scrooge missed out on some very pleasant hours and some very pleasant company. And he can't find those in his moldy old office or gloomy apartment. Still, my dear, I plan to invite him every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may continue to criticize Christmas as long as he lives, but if I keep going there year after year in good spirits, who knows? He might even give poor Bob Cratchit a Christmas gift of £50 one day. Everyone laughed at the idea, but that they laughed too because of the good-natured spirit of the holiday. After tea, the group turned to the music. Fred's wife played the harp, and everyone sang a simple little tune which touched Scrooge deeply as he listened, for it was the favorite song years ago of his sister, Fan. Alphabet games and quizzes games followed, with all the guests, young and old, joining in. For that matter, so did old Scrooge, who was so interested they forgot for the moment that his voice could not be heard as he called out answers to the quizzes. The ghost was pleased to see Scrooge like this, but it was now time to go. Please, begged Scrooge, let me stay for just one more game. The game was yes and no. Fred had to think of something or someone, and the guests had to guess what or who by asking the questions that could only be answered. Yes, it is an animal, Fred answered to the first question. Yes, a live animal. Yes, a rather disagreeable animal. Yes, a savage animal. Yes, an animal that growled and grunted. Yes, an animal that even talked sometimes. Yes, it lived in London and walked in the streets. No, it wasn't a show. No, it wasn't led by anybody. No, it didn't live in a manger. No, it was never killed in a market. No, it wasn't a horse, cow, bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a hog, or a cat, or a bear. With each question, Fred burst into a fresh roar of laughter. He was so delighted and laughed so hard that he had to get up from his sofa and stamp his feet. At last, one of the ladies, roaring with laughter herself, cried out, I know what it is, Fred. I guessed it. What is it? It's your Uncle Scrooge. And she was correct. But you should have said yes to it. It is a bear, one of the guests said. Well, now, my friend, said Fred, now that Uncle Scrooge has helped us have such a merry time, we must drink a toast to health. Lifting glasses, Fred cried, to Uncle Scrooge. To Uncle Scrooge, cried the guests, to Uncle Scrooge's health. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whether he is at wherever he is, added, he wouldn't take these wishes from me in person, but now he has them. Nevertheless, to Uncle Scrooge. They all lifted their glasses up. Uncle Scrooge became so lighthearted that he was about to thank the guests for the fine toast and wish them a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year in return. But the Spirit did not give him time. For the entire scene passed away as Scrooge's nephew was uttering his last words, and Scrooge and the Spirit were once again on their way. They traveled far and they saw much. They visited many homes. They stood beside sick beds, suddenly made cheerful for reasons that people couldn't explain. They saw poverty and misery in workhouses, hospitals, and jails, but left each scene with the people a little richer and a little happier with the Spirit's blessings. It was a long night. What was strange, however, was that while Scrooge did not change in appearance, the ghost seemed to grow older and older. Scrooge noticed that as the night wore on, are the Spirit's lives so short, he asked? My life on earth is very short, said the ghost. It ends tonight at midnight, answered the Spirit. Listen now, for my time is drawing near. You must beware of ignorance and greed, for they mean doom to all mankind, unless you and all mankind can change it. The clock began to strike the hour of 12. Scrooge looked around for the Spirit, but he had gone. And at the last stroke resounded, Scrooge remembered Marley's prediction of the third ghost's arrival at the last stroke of midnight. And lifting his eyes, Scrooge saw before him a phantom, draped and hooded, coming towards him. Next chapter, tomorrow, chapter 6, The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. What do you say, Danny? Good night, everybody.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching. Happy Thanksgiving. Fireside Stories. Good night.